Hi. Um, so the study that I'll be presenting today evaluates trajectories of autism symptom severity across childhood. And autism is behaviorally defined through the presence of two core symptom domains, the social communication deficits and the restricted repetitive behaviors. And these two core domains also vary in their severity levels, ranging from low severity to high severity for different individuals on the spectrum. So before starting graduate school, I used to work in specialized ASD preschools, גני התקשורת של העמותה לילדים בסיכון, as part of, תודה. As part of my internship in clinical psychology. And it was very clear that different children did show different severity levels to their symptoms. But it was also clear that children progress differently across time. So some of the children, they were making these really exciting gains. They were becoming more engaged with their environment. They were becoming more social, gaining social and communication skills. But other children, it seemed like no matter how much intervention they received, their symptoms were getting worse over time. They were becoming less engaged, more detached from their environment, mostly focused on their restricted and repetitive interests. And that experience is what led me to my research question, which is, does the severity of autism change across childhood? And if so, what are the predicting factors of change? So looking at the literature, it seems like the answer to this question is rather inconsistent. Some of the studies have identified that most children remain stable in their symptom severity. So about 80 to 90% of kids remain stable across childhood. But other studies have found change to a much larger extent, either because more children are changing over time or because children are changing more in their symptoms. This study that I'll be presenting today, in this study, what we did was we evaluated children's autism symptom severity trajectories starting at age 3, so at the beginning of early childhood, and all the way up to middle childhood at about age 11, in order to answer two questions. The first was, how common is symptom severity change across childhood? And the second was, what predicts either increase or decrease in symptom severity across childhood? So this study is actually a part of a larger study. It's part of the Autism Phenome Project at the UC Davis Mind Institute in California. The Autism Phenome Project is a longitudinal study, now in its 16th year. It includes more than 500 kids now, both children diagnosed with autism and typically developing matched controls. And children are evaluated at several time points across childhood using a comprehensive assessment battery. So behavioral measures, parental questionnaires, medical data, blood draws, and nighttime MRI with no sedation, with the goal of trying to define clinically meaningful subtypes of autism. And in the study that I'll be showing today, we used a sample of the kids. So we used 182 children from the database of the Autism Phenome Project, 128 boys and 54 girls. So we had like a nice ratio of about 30% girls. And the kids were evaluated at 3 time points across childhood. So time 1 was study entry. Kids ranged from 2 to 3.5 years of age. This is our beginning of early childhood time point with a mean age of 3. The next time point that behavioral data were collected was time 3, the end of early childhood time point. Children ranged from 4 to 6 years of age with a mean age of 5 and 8 months. And our last time point was time 4, the middle childhood time point. So children were between 9 to 12 years of age with a mean age of 11 and a half. Our primary measure to measure autism symptoms was the ADOS, so the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. This is, of course, the gold standard assessment tool for autism symptoms in both clinical and research use. And in order to evaluate the severity of autism symptoms, we used the Calibrated Severity Scores, or the CSS. The Calibrated Severity Scores is a standardized metric. It runs from 1 to 10, with 1 being the least severe and 10 being the most severe, and 4 being the cutoff score to receive a diagnosis of autism. And because this is a standardized metric, it allows us to compare severity levels for different children, for children across different ages, and also between children of different developmental abilities, so different IQ levels and language abilities. But we didn't want to look at children's scores. We wanted to look at their change. So what we did was, for each child, we calculated a severity change score for each childhood period. So for instance, to look at change during early childhood, we subtracted each child's ADOS calibrated, their times 3 ADOS calibrated severity score from their time 1 score to create a change score across early childhood. And we did the same for middle childhood. We subtracted children's times 3 score from their time 4 ADOS calibrated severity score to create a change score across middle childhood. And what you see here is the distribution of change scores for the sample. So on the left in panel A, you see the distribution of change scores in the sample during early childhood. And on the right in panel B, you see the distribution of change scores for middle childhood. So the negative numbers represent a decrease in severity, so an improvement in symptoms. And the positive numbers represent an increase in severity, so a worsening of symptoms across childhood. And in order to determine how much change can be considered statistically significant change in symptom severity, we use the Reliable Change Index, or the RCI. So the Reliable Change Index is a statistic that determines, based on the characteristics of this specific samples, the means and the standard distributions, what can be considered statistically significant change. So above and beyond measurement error and random variation. And for this specific sample, that was a 2, meaning a change of 2 ADOS calibrated severity scores, either increase or decrease in severity, can be considered statistically significant change. And anything below that is considered stability. And based on that criteria, we created 3 groups. So what you see here are, on the left, early childhood, and on the right, the middle childhood, children that changed by either 0 or 1 calibrated severity score, so they're considered stable across that period. These are children that decreased in their symptom severity during either early or middle childhood. And these, in the positive numbers, are the children who increased in their symptom severity during either early or middle childhood. So our first question was, how common is autism symptom severity across childhood? And what you see in this figure are the trajectories during early childhood for the 3 groups. So in blue are the children who remain stable across time. They were a bit more than half of the children in the sample, so 54% of children, and they remain stable across childhood, across early childhood, from age 3 to age 6. In green are the children that decreased in their symptom severity. Almost 30% of the kids reduced the severity of their symptoms during early childhood. And in red are the kids who increased in the severity of their symptoms, about 17% of the sample. And as more data were being collected, we wanted to see how these children are doing as they go into middle childhood. So we extended their trajectories up to time 4. And we created, again we identified 3 severity change groups in the sample. So in blue, almost half of the sample are the kids who remain stable from age 3 to age 11. In green are at 27% are the kids who decreased in symptom severity. And in red, 24% of the sample are kids who increased in their symptom severity across childhood. And because here we're comparing, we have 2 time periods, we have early and middle childhood, we could also compare change between the 2 periods. And what we saw was that for increasing severity, the kids who increased in severity, they increased during both early and middle childhood. But this was not the case for decrease in severity. So children decreased in severity mostly during early childhood, while in middle childhood there was some severity decrease but for fewer children and to a much lower extent. So just to recap on question 1, it seems like about half of the children in the sample significantly changed in the severity of their autism symptoms across childhood, and change happened differently during the two childhood periods. So increase in severity happened during both early and middle childhood, but decrease in severity was far more common during early compared to middle childhood. Our second question was that we wanted to see what would predict either decrease or increase in symptom severity. And we found 4 factors that associated with symptom severity change and one that did not. So first, looking at IQ, we found that children that had IQ during early childhood was associated with symptom severity change during early childhood. So the children that had higher IQs at both ages, the children that had higher IQs at ages 3 and 6 decreased in the severity of their autism symptoms during early childhood, while the children who had lower IQs during early childhood remained stable, and they did not make IQ gains, and their symptoms increased over time. We did not find an association between symptom severity change during middle childhood and IQ during middle childhood. We also looked at parental characteristics, and what we found was that children who decreased in their symptom severity had parents who were older and more educated, while the children who increased in their symptom severity had parents who were younger and less educated. And these differences were significant for both the mothers and the fathers of the children in both groups. We also looked at sex differences. And what you see here in this figure is the sex distribution of girls on the left and boys on the right into the 3 severity change groups. So both boys and girls had a strong tendency to remain stable in symptom severity across childhood. But if change did occur, girls were far more likely to decrease in their symptom severity compared to increase, while for boys there was no difference between the type of change that they will undergo. We looked at adaptive functioning, and what we saw was that adaptive functioning based on the Vineland is associated with symptom severity change. So when we looked at the kids at time 1 when they were 3, all 3 groups had exactly the same adaptive functioning level. But when they were 6 years, the children who increased in symptom severity had lower adaptive functioning compared to the other kids in the sample. And what you see here is the trajectory of adaptive functioning for the increased severity group. So for the kids who will increase in the severity of their symptoms across childhood. And what we see is in red is the adaptive composite score, and the rest are the subdomains. And what we see is that the adaptive functioning standardized scores are decreasing across childhood, meaning that in parallel to the fact that these children are increasing in their autism symptoms, they are reducing not in adaptive skills, but in the rate at which they are gaining adaptive skills across childhood, like adaptive abilities, like independent skills, daily social skills, and so on. And last, we looked at a child's initial severity level at age 3. We wanted to know whether children's initial severity level at the time that they're diagnosed is a good predictor of how they will change across childhood. And what you see here is a scatter plot showing children's severity levels at time 1, so at age 3, and at time 3 at age 6. Every dot here is a child colored by their group membership. And if you look at time 1, you will see that the green dots, the kids who will decrease in their symptoms during early childhood, they're scattered all over the axis, so in all over the severity levels. So what we see here is that children, is that children who will decrease in the severity of their symptoms have a wide range of initial severity levels at the time of diagnosis, meaning this is not a good predictor of future change. So to recap question 2, what predicts either increase or decrease in symptom severity? We see that children who decrease in severity, the decrease in severity is associated with being a girl, having higher IQ and adaptive functioning during early childhood, having more older and more educated parents, but not with the severity level at the time of diagnosis. And for children who increase in severity, they have a lower IQ and lower adaptive functioning at age 6, and also younger, less educated parents compared to the other kids in the sample. So when we're thinking about these findings and what could they mean, we see that autism symptom severity can change substantially during childhood. And also the change is not linear, so it can happen differently during different periods of childhood. We also see that several characteristics of children, like sex, IQ, and adaptive functioning, as well as characteristics of their parents, are associated with change. And very importantly, the children can decrease in the severity of their symptoms regardless of their initial severity level at time of diagnosis. So we're also looking at these findings, thinking about how to extend them, how can we keep investigating these questions. So first, time 5 is now being collected. Time 5 is the adolescent time point, and adolescence is a period that is characterized with social challenges. So social challenges are becoming more complex as children grow older, and we're thinking that we might see, at least for some of the children, an increase, especially in their social deficits, as they encounter these challenges. We're also thinking about these interactions that we see between symptom severity change and the other predictors of change, or the covariates of change. And we want to see how these interactions will impact the developmental trajectory of these children as it unfolds across time. And if it does have the potential of maybe, it has the potential for us to help us identify clinically meaningful subtypes of autism using several developmental factors combined. And last, we're very interested in the sex differences. It's very interesting that girls seem to be decreasing in their symptom severity more than boys across childhood. And there's a growing body of literature talking about camouflage, that some individuals on the spectrum are actually learning how to mask their symptoms in social situations in order to appear less autistic. And studies show that girls do this more than boys. So as we're thinking about the fact that girls are showing a decrease in their symptom severity over time, we're thinking this might show that girls have a better prognosis for their autism symptoms. Or alternatively, it might show that girls are gaining the ability to mask their symptoms with age. And this is a question that we are exploring in a new study that we're starting now. So I'd like to thank my advisor, David Emerald, everyone at the Autism Phenome Project and the Autism Center of Excellence at the Mind Institute, funding agencies, and of course all the children and the families that took part in the study. Thank you.
Questions? If not,
Yeah.
I have.
Yeah.
We can't hear.
I wanted to ask if you did look at the therapies and treatment within your research, and all the children get the same level of therapies and treatment.
She was asking about intervention, right? Intervention history. Great question. Thank you. I was hoping someone would ask that.
I was thinking.
I want to ask.
Can I just answer and then...
Sorry.
So we did look at intervention history, and we actually found differences. So we found that the children who decreased in severity, they had received more and more intense intervention as toddlers before they entered the study, compared to the children who increased in severity, who had received less and less intense interventions. But when we looked at the intervention history in the same model with especially with parental characteristics, the differences in intervention were no longer significant. So what we're thinking is it might be the case that differences in intervention are working through the parental characteristics, because it makes sense, right? That parents who are more educated, they have more resources, they have more time and knowledge and money to take their kids to more intervention the moment that they receive the diagnosis. So something is going on there, and we need to clean up the data more, and we want to explore it further. So thank you for the question. Yeah. Sean?
Did you check out the possibility that the changes are related not to the intrinsic feature of the ASD, but to the relation of the environment to the children? And this is, may explain the difference in the parents' education and age, because if you have the problematic child, you can relate to him as very problematic and without any hope, and this will give the decreasing of the increasing of the severity.
Yeah.
You understand? It's not the problem of the ASD, but the problem of the
Neglect. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it makes a lot of sense. And I don't know if we have those kinds of measures, or if we look at the interaction somehow between the parent and the child. We should. It's very important. I don't think we have that kind of data, but it would be super interesting to try and examine how. I know other studies are looking at that too. I know that in studies from Wisconsin, that's exactly what they're looking at, and what they found, that the interaction between kids and parents. So the better the interaction, especially between the mother and the child, they see a decrease in the severity of children's symptoms, especially as they go into older ages. So that's a great point. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you have any data about psychiatric comorbidities with these three groups?
Yes. So I didn't have time to show that too. That's a manuscript that we're now finishing up and going to submit. We looked at symptom severity change in relation to the emergence of psychopathology. And just to say, in like one sentence, we see that actually an increase in the severity of social communication symptoms during middle childhood and a decrease in the severity of RRBs is associated with the emergence of anxiety. And we have several measures of anxiety, and we're trying to analyze that, and we're trying to see, is it different? I mean, and RRBs are a variety of different behaviors. So we're trying to understand that more, but it definitely seems that changes in symptom severity are associated with especially anxiety, but also with ADHD symptoms, and with all types of aggressive behaviors. Thank you.